This is the brand new Royal Enfield Shotgun 650, the fourth bike in the brand's 650 platform family, joining the Interceptor 650 Retro Upright Naked, the Continental GT Cafe Racer, and the stretched-out cruiser-style Super Meteor 650. Over the past year or two, I've been lucky enough to ride all of them so naturally with so many shared components and hardware. I thought I had a pretty good idea of what to expect from this one. While some parts of the shotgun do feel quite familiar, after spending a couple weeks on it, there are a few things that have genuinely surprised me. In this video, we'll take it for a spin, and I'll explain exactly why, if there are any standout quirks or strengths that you definitely need to know about. The most familiar part of the shotgun has to be the engine, with the same 650 parallel twin as the other three bikes, and there's no dramatically different tune either. Peak power is around 46 horsepower, and peak torque is about 52 Newton meters. Any small differences on the spec sheet are likely down to tiny tweaks, such as the shape of the exhaust for styling rather than real performance gains. On the plus side, the 270 degrees crank gives the engine a really nice character along with a meaty, satisfying sound, even if it's not especially loud. I also think the air and oil cooling setup adds a bit of authenticity to the retro vibe, which I believe will appeal to plenty of potential buyers. The gearbox has a reassuring mechanical clunk. The clutch action is reasonably light, and the 13.8-liter fuel tank feels ample for the kind of riding this bike is intended for, giving a theoretical range of around 300 kilometers or just shy of 200 miles. On the downside, you could argue that 46 horses feels a bit limp for a 650 twin, especially compared with other liquid-cooled retros, such as the Kawasaki Z650RS or Yamaha XSR 700, which make closer to 70 horsepower. Combine that with the roughly 240 kilograms wet weight, and the sense of acceleration becomes noticeably dulled. So this isn't a bike for straight-line thrill seekers. But realistically, most people considering an Enfield will already know that and will be more interested in the overall relaxed, pleasant feel and likability of the bike. On the tech side, there's also a lot of carryover. The dash with its big analog speedo around the outside and an LCD in the middle is essentially the same as on the Super Meteor, and it's easy to read. The switchgear is familiar too, feels nice to the touch, and is intuitively laid out, while the Tripper navigation pod on the side pairs with your phone for simple turn-by-turn prompts, just as it does on many other Enfield models. Beyond that, though, the bike isn't exactly cutting edge. There are no riding modes, no traction control, no engine brake control, and no wheelie control, but given the relatively modest power-to-weight ratio, you could argue they're not really necessary. So far, so familiar. But here's where things start to get a bit more unexpected. The Shotgun 650 has the most in common with the Super Meteor, and you can see that clearly if you put the two bikes side by side and compare their frames. The Super Meteor is built and styled as a proper cruiser, with a relatively long wheelbase and a low-slung riding position, but the Shotgun feels very different as soon as you sit on it because your seat is nowhere near the floor. The spec sheet confirms a seat height of 795 millimeters, which is much closer to a naked bike, and the foot pegs are mid-positioned, so there's no long stretch for the legs. The handlebars are only slightly risen, looking more like those on a naked retro than a big cruiser-style ape-hanger. So all of this adds up to a riding position that feels quite neutral, and, more importantly, far more sporty than you'd expect from a bike based on a cruiser platform. There are also some significant changes to the chassis. The wheelbase is much shorter, paired with an 18-inch front wheel instead of the Super Meteor's 19-inch, which makes the Shotgun noticeably more flickable and willing to change direction than most bikes under the cruiser banner. Suspension comes from Showa, with upside-down fork legs up front and a pair of twin shocks at the rear. There's no adjustment beyond preload on the rear, but the setup feels quite firm and sporty, so there's very little dive under braking despite the bike's considerable heft. At the same time, it's not particularly harsh. On less-than-perfect European launch roads, I've found it reasonably comfortable. So overall, the balance feels nicely tuned, with a slight bias toward handling. The one area that still feels very much like a classic cruiser is the brakes. The front has a softer feel, while the rear uses a big 300mm disc with a two-piston caliper that feels quite beefy, so you really do need to use both controls to stop the bike quickly. If you're used to relying mostly on the front brake, this might take a little getting used to, but most riders adapt their style quite quickly. Once you're up to speed, though, the bike is a real pleasure to ride through corners, and the rider triangle feels far more engaging than I'd expected. Another factor that adds to the experience is the shotgun's styling and finish. As is typical for Royal Enfield, there's a strong range of bold colors, and the shotgun leans into punchy, high-contrast graphics that give it a more modern look. The blacked-out hardware, rather than polished chrome, contrasts nicely with the more bling Super Meteor, and the details, like the headlight surround and the yoke clamps, look especially well-designed and give the bike a higher-end feel that seems to punch above its price point. At the rear, there's an interesting reconfigurable tail section that lets you run the shotgun as a single seat bobber, a 2-up with the subframe bolted back on, or with the seat removed but the subframe installed as a handy little luggage rack, which is great for weekend trips or stylish commuting. The bike starts at around 6,699 pounds, and while that might seem a lot for a 46 horsepower parallel twin, you have to look at it in context. Competitors like the Honda Rebel 500, Kawasaki Vulcan S, and even the Triumph bobbers sit in different price brackets, with the Triumph in particular being well out of the way at the higher end. After riding the shotgun, the bike it reminds me of most, having owned one in the past, is the Triumph Speed Twin 900, formerly the Street Twin. It doesn't come from the cruiser segment, but it shares a similar engine feel, a good level of agility and flickability, an 18-inch front wheel and 17-inch rear, plus modern-leaning retro styling and a simple, approachable tech package. The Triumph does offer more peak power, a bit more torque, a lighter overall weight, and a front Brembo brake that feels more reassuring, but the shotgun's handling, finish, and overall character are getting impressively close, especially when you consider that the Triumph costs almost 9,000 pounds. Ultimately, the point I'm trying to make is that you shouldn't write the Shotgun 650 off as just another cruiser if that isn't your thing, because you're getting a lot of the same cool looks, fun handling, and versatile riding position as something like the Triumph, just at a much more attractive price. It's a great option if you're willing to trade a little power and outright performance for strong value and a lot of character. As always, I'd love to hear what you think of it, so drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you haven't already to see more of the latest new bike reviews like this one right here on YouTube. Many thanks for watching today, and I'll catch you in the next video.